picture. 2 long years and what it was. He still got you, I can tell. I'm wasting time trying to break his spell. I can't forget how sweet it was before he came and took your love.
I was a deputy sheriff for 23 years. I started in 1957. I left for a couple of years, was an insurance adjuster. Most of my time was spent as a detective, either in the juvenile division or the detective division. For 8 years, I headed up the sex crime squad. I've investigated every type of crime imaginable except for treason. I assisted the homicide squad in trying to find Ted Bundy, serial murderers and serial rapists. So I've had a lot of experience.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is John Llewellyn, a very important man who has contributed to more lives than he himself is aware of. John, would you please tell our listening audience who you are?
Well, I'm just an old man that loves life and has made life an adventure.
Life, an adventure. You're an author of many books. You've been involved in many serious court cases that you personally have investigated, and you have changed a lot of lives, John. So please don't be modest. Let's go ahead and tell people who you are.
If I've changed any lives, I hope it's been for the better.
Yes, you have.
But what little involvement I have had in exposing Mormon fundamentalism for what it really is has been rewarding. And of course, my background is as an investigator with the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office. That's where I first became involved with Mormonism and Mormon fundamentalism, the polygamists. I was in charge of all the sex crimes. And if you ever want to know anything about human behavior, study their sex habits and their politics and their religion. And here you have it all in Mormon fundamentalism because it's a theology. The captain of the detectives started giving me all of the polygamous complaints because they didn't know what else to do with them. And so they thought it was a sex crime. And you know, when you get right down to the nitty-gritty, they really are. They're both a sex crime and a vice. It's both. So that's, I was impressed with a lot of the fundamentalists that I came in contact with. And to begin with, I didn't know how to approach it. So I got in touch with the old sheriff down in Washington County. I remember his name was Whitehead, and he had retired. And I knew that he had dealt with the polygamists down there in the FLDS. So I says, you know, what do I do? And he says, well, there's not going to be much you can do because it's hard to get anybody to testify. But if you have a polygamist who is out of order and doing something wrong, making himself a nuisance, find out who his leader is. Get acquainted with the leader, and then usually you can go to that leader and say, hey, so-and-so is making a spectacle of himself, trying to convert his neighbors. You better call him off, and of course that's exactly what happened. So that's what I did. I got acquainted with Rulon Allred, who was the leader at that time, and Rulon Jeffs, who was the leader of the Salt Lake faction of the FLDS, and it all began from there. And I got acquainted with the Kingston people, and it was mostly Merlin Kingston, and this was when all of a sudden Herbal LeBaron was harassing them all. And so all the fundamentalists, they had nobody to contact in law enforcement to trust, but I was able to gain their confidence and trust as a result of the Herbal LeBaron thing, both with the Kingstons and the AUB. Of course, the FLDS was still pretty standoffish. But I could go and talk with Rulon Jeffs if I needed to. I was on Bill O'Reilly's show. Well, we talked about the investigation I was involved in with the Harmston group. What I have learned as a result of my involvement with Mormon fundamentalism, you know, you have the clinical psychologists and psychiatrists that study human behavior. And what I have learned, I have tried to share with both law enforcement. I've spoken at the Utah Peace Officers Association. I've met with law enforcement agencies, both federal and local, and give them my input to help them better understand and combat the crimes that occur.
I'd like you to tell folks about the crime cases that you worked on, that you uncovered, and the position that you took, and the books that you have written, because those are the things and made you actually a pillar of strength for those seeking wisdom and help to get out, even though you were not personally necessarily funding them. You were giving them an ally by saying, yes, I recognize your story is not isolated. You are not alone. You validated them as human beings because they had been told it didn't happen. They'd been told their own life didn't happen, that the crimes committed against them didn't happen. And you gave them back their self-esteem by what you did. Please continue.
Well, I have to be perfectly honest. In analyzing the people that I know in AUB and the TLC that I've come in contact with, for those who were converted, most of the single women, most of the women that are converted into the AUB from the LDS Church are single women with children who have had a terrible monogamous relationship. And that old adage that the fundamentalists use, that they would rather have part of a good man than all of a bad man, works. The trouble is, in too many cases, these women go into it, and this guy appears to be good, but he really isn't. Because you have the favorite wife, and if she can go in and be the favorite wife, that's great. And then you have competition among the wives to be the favorite wife, or the dominant wife, and I mean it's just not a good relationship. A lot of the polygamous men go to those dances to convert plural wives. I can name several instances where this has happened. It's all so much deception involved, you know, and so many of the plural wives were dependent upon food stamps or help from relatives or someone else because there just wasn't enough money to go around. But George Maycock, who happened to be a counselor with the same status as an apostle in the LDS Church, kept taking these young wives, but there's no way he could afford them, and he would have to be a recipient of welfare from the polygamous group himself, and because he held this high office, they always did help him. But then he was drummed out of the group because of allegedly molesting his own daughters. The people in AUB claim to be the chosen, the only ones on earth who are living all of God's laws. And that's why they think that they have the priesthood, the one and only priesthood that was set up by Joseph Smith. However, 3 of their counselors, their apostles, high priest apostles, have been drummed out of the group for allegedly molesting their daughters. One was Joe Thompson. He was drummed out on a priesthood court, but there was never enough evidence that they could bring it before the Attorney General or the state. He wasn't prosecuted. Then there was George Maycock. He was drummed out. And I saw George in the grocery store, and this was after I had left, and I said, "Hey, George, is what I hear about you true?" And he says, "Yes, it's all true." And he says, okay, and he went off on his own. And then there was Chevro Palacio, a Mexican fellow. And I've investigated every sex crime that you can imagine. But what this man was doing with his grandchildren and his wife was just totally despicable. But at least he did have the gumptions not to deny it. He admitted it. He was arrested and he was sent to prison. I'm sure he spent 5 years. I don't know if he's still down there or not. But here's 3 men supposedly chosen by God who have been accused and drummed out of the group for allegedly molesting their daughters. What happened? What God was it that helped choose him? No, they're supposed to be chosen through inspiration. But this goes to show you that there is a sex problem in every single one of these fundamentalist groups, because even though they differ in who has the authority, it's the revelation 132 which they all have in common, and they take from that what they want. When Mitchell kidnapped Elizabeth Smart, he did not sin within the concept of Mormon fundamentalism, because there's only one rule, and that is you must be a polygamist. It doesn't say how. It doesn't give you any directions on how to go about it, only that you have to be a polygamist. Now, we know that he tried to get a plural wife through conventional means. He contacted the gal from the Kingston's group who was trying to seduce her. So, in order to live a greater law, he had to break a lower law. So, you know, he didn't sin. And then I found it interesting that the media did not play up the fact that he was a fundamentalist, a Mormon fundamentalist. They just played the fact that he was just an ordinary sex offender, kidnapper. But he was a product of Mormon fundamentalism. All of his history, all of the writings and everything. He had his own version, but he was a Mormon fundamentalist. So, you know, and you can go back to Ervil LeBaron, a mass murderer, and even before that, Ron and Dan Lafferty. And when I was writing for the Event News Weekly, a weekly newspaper, I got an interview. Jack Ford was the PR guy, and of course I knew him from law enforcement. He set me up with an interview with Dan Lafferty. I interviewed him before Krakauer did his book, and I've got pictures and letters and stuff from Dan that somebody might find interesting, that they could use. It doesn't matter which group it is. Some will claim to be more moral and more righteous than the other groups, but you can find the same foibles in all of them, and it all boils down to sex and the pursuit of sex. And it all boils down to sex and the pursuit of sex.
Our guest today is Andrea Moore Emmett. She is the author of God's Brothel, and believe me, it's a very enticing book of what fundamentalist polygamy is really all about.
Hi, thank you so much.
How did you get involved in writing this wonderful book?
I was writing for Salt Lake City Weekly as an investigative reporter. One story led to another and another. Before I knew it, this was in 1997, I was amassing interviews, research, material, all kinds of information that I was coming across that nobody had reported on before. I was really the first reporter to do in-depth reporting on the crimes and the abuses in polygamy. And, you know, your job as a journalist is to shine a light on the dark corners, to bring some justice to injustices that no one's paying attention to. The abuses of children, the civil rights violations, the human rights violations against children, women. I decided I would write a book, and that's how the book came about in 2004.
Your book has changed lives. I hope you're aware of that. So many of these women have wept because no one would believe them. And when their own family saw their pain, they punished them for it because they're not supposed to show their pain. Godly women don't show their pain, they get over it. Their emotional and psychological needs are considered weaknesses to overcome. And your book was so blatantly honest. I was captivated. There were so many human rights violations.
For children, simply the brutality that children have to live with from the cradle. Babies being trained not to cry, waterboarding babies, holding them under faucets till they stop crying, slapping them till they stop crying, not even having simple food that's nutritious. Children who didn't know the taste of fruit unless it was rotted. Children who haven't had an education. You know, anywhere in the world, it is a human right to have an education, but these children are not given a decent education, and they're many times pulled out of school at very, very young ages so they can be child labor, or they can start having families. And the child labor law is completely flouted. There's the trafficking of girls. If anybody else were to throw their 13, 14-year-old son out on the street, a parent would be hauled in for criminal neglect of a child. But because it happens in polygamy, oh well, children who are pulled out of school and not given an education, parents would be charged with not giving their kids an education. There'd be truancy officers coming down on them. But in polygamy, oh well. And the trafficking of girls across state lines and across international borders. It's polygamy, they get a free pass. These people, because of freedom of religion and parental rights, they're somehow excused, which it's completely ridiculous because all of our freedoms have restrictions. Religious freedom is no different. Parental rights don't mean you can do anything you want with your children. You can't abuse them like they say in the FLDS. You can all but kill a child for deliberately disobeying. And they do. There's the sexual abuse that is just unbelievably rampant. The intermarriage, the incest, and children born with so many birth defects. And then just burying a child in the backyard, burying him on the desert. This happens and they know it.
Why don't you think they do anything about it?
There's a lot of reasons. That's a very convoluted kind of answer. For one thing, again, the religious freedom, and other thing is parental rights. So our country is becoming even more and more leaning toward religion can do anything.
Did you find all of these fundamentalist polygamous cults that claimed or blamed Mormonism for their behavior to be affiliated with each other and intermarrying? Did you find them connected?
The Mormon ones are all very connected. They're not connected to the Christian fundamentalist polygamists. That's a whole other thing. I mean, they practice polygamy based on Bible, scripture. The Mormon fundamentalist polygamists are very interconnected. There's plenty of stories of one group will exchange a daughter for another one's daughter in another group. They're all very much in touch with each other. It's kind of a little bit of a club in that way. Even though they believe that their prophet has the keys over the other guy's prophet, they still all do stay very much in contact with each other.
Did you find a lot of child brides and underage marriages in any or all of these groups?
I did in all of the groups. Some of them are backing away from it as much as possible, especially verbally. Some of them like to say that they haven't done it or they never did do it. There's evidence that they have done it in their recent past, if not more recently. Some of them continue to do it to this day. They don't care because they believe in God's law, not man's law, and they believe they have God's law. So they are doing it no matter what. The FLDS, for example, was doing it long before Warren Jeffs came along, and they're going to do it long after he is locked away. They're all very hypocritical when they say they haven't done it, because there's evidence in every single one of them that they have.
A lot of the girls that have escaped have been threatened with blood atonement. Are you familiar with that?
I am familiar with that. Again, it's a teaching from early Mormonism, and that's where those who are enemies of the church have to spill their blood to atone for it, or those who are apostate have to spill their blood to atone for it. So in these polygamous groups, they believe that when these women get away, that they are apostate, or they have become an enemy of the church, and the only way they can atone is to have their blood spilled. So it's a very cautionary tale. It's a threat they hold over these women to control them, that the only way they can atone is to die, and that will be carried out on them, that someone will be sent to do that. So a lot of them, when they leave, they do live in fear, or a lot of them that might leave don't leave because of that fear.
I've had a lot of women tell me that. A lot of them.
Right. Yeah, me too.
They say it's part of their faith, but what about a faith that teaches that it's okay to kill somebody if they don't think like you do? Doesn't that sound a little Taliban-like?
Well, there's a lot of things about the polygamous fundamentalist groups that are very Talibanish.
Did you see a lot of child labor? Was that brought to you?
Oh, absolutely, I did. The Kingston group in Salt Lake is notorious for child labor. FLDS is notorious for child labor. They've got a workforce that they don't pay, and that's how they underbid. That's how the FLDS underbid in the construction business in every state where they are. And in their other businesses, the Kingstons, they don't pay their people, they don't pay their adults or their children, but they have a huge, huge workforce that's making millions and millions of dollars for them. Now, the Kingstons pay with script. It's just a few cents on the dollar, and then they have to use it within their own church-owned companies. They have their own economy. These are people who are a law unto themselves. It's like a nation within the nation. These are American-born citizens that don't have full rights as American citizens. They're living in such a bubble of mind control, and it's all about God, and it's all about obedience to their leaders. And the women who say they're happy in polygamy, again, these are women who are mind controlled in many cases, women who have been born into polygamy, who don't know anything else. They don't have anything to compare it to. You're not really talking about women who actually have choices. You know, we can talk about slavery, where slaves didn't want to be emancipated because they felt protected by their benevolent masters. These women, for whatever reason, especially if they're a favorite wife, they have some perks, or if they're in a family where the husband is a leader, they have some perks, and so there's a certain amount of status for where they are, and for what they know and where they are and the position they have, they think they're happy. But you know, they haven't got any choices to compare that to.
So many of these cults require absolutely blind obedience, so that means the women were never allowed to make a decision in their life. So that's got to be a great fear, because in making a decision, you have to be responsible for it. And they actually have had several of them tell me that they honestly believe that they're not responsible if they're obedient. They can actually become a perpetrator and force their own child into a child marriage, and they believe they're not responsible because it wasn't their decision.
That's exactly right. The higher law is to be obedient to the authority, or to the leader of the church, or even their husband, because priesthood authority speaks directly to God.
Irene, are these lost boys, these young men, teenagers that are kicked out of these different cults, is that a situation that goes on in all of the cults? Is it common?
Absolutely. The reason why is that these young boys are taken away from their cults and their compounds, and have to go work with their cousins or uncles, whoever, to go make money, and they give the money to their fathers so that their fathers can marry younger and more wives and expand their families. And I know even with my own children, I had 7 sons, and they went out by the time they were 15, all of them, and just worked, gave almost everything they had to their dad. And they felt it was a great imposition. They were, you know, really heartbroken that they were taken out and had to do this. But I've seen in so many of the groups, the reason they do it is so that the men, the older men, have access to the girls. And that's why they make the rules that there's no kissing, there's no courting, there's no nothing. And most of the groups assign you to someone. But you know, the way they get away with it, they say, the Lord told me that you belong to so-and-so. And that's who you belong to. Well, how can you refute it and say you're not going to marry somebody that God himself said you should marry him, whether he's 92 or not, you know?
Yeah, a lot of the girls have told me that they had a choice, and the choice was to do as they were told or suffer the consequences. Well,
even with Earl, he told several girls, you can marry this person or that person. He would name them. You can marry this person or that person. But if you don't, so you do have a choice. But if you don't, you will be destroyed. So it doesn't matter that they were old men, you know, that didn't matter. But they went ahead and did it because they felt that their life was in jeopardy, and there's a part of them too that they want to help build a kingdom. When you're promised that you're going to become a goddess in the next life and own your own world, I mean, my golly, that's pretty enticing, you know, and you think, well, at least I got something to look forward to.
In the next life, you suffer this, you know, flush this life down the toilet to make someone else a god, and we'll give you a crown in heaven to what? More of the same?
Well, they would tell us that this life was nothing more than a drop in the bucket. It's going to go by so fast, and it doesn't matter about this life. It's everything is for the next life. Make the sacrifice, and we're going to have all these rewards in the next life. But it's pretty disheartening when you see your life going by and you're not loved, you're not needed, you're not validated, you're not educated, you're not, you know, whatever your needs aren't met. And, you know, as women, we're not stupid. I mean, we can see that we're being shafted.